One of the places I've always wanted to go was Egypt. It's been on my bucket list for as long as I can remember. And when we started planning this trip, we made Egypt a priority. And I'm happy to say it looks like it's going to happen. And joining me today to talk about Egypt is my friend Syed. Syed, welcome to My Home is Special.
Thanks a lot, Keith. It's great to be here, and I'm honored that you've included me.
Now, Syed, when I first thought about going to Egypt, I got to admit, you were the first person that I thought of, and a huge priority for me was to get you on the podcast. But why don't we start by just introducing yourself to people listening so they get a sense of who you are?
So I grew up in Cairo, Egyptian parents, left for college, moved around quite a bit, which you'll know. I guess we connected first in Chicago, but I studied in the Midwest and then worked in the Midwest in Chicago, moved to West Africa and then London, back to the US, and now back in London. So I've moved around quite a bit, worked across different industries, and I guess a symptom or maybe a feature of my kind of moving around is really growing up feeling sort of different in a pretty, what I would say, a pretty defined social structure in Egypt, and kind of moving around, I guess, in a weird way has in many ways allowed me to really articulate, why I love Egypt. I guess I never really knew exactly why I loved it, and as I've sort of traveled around the world, I've grown to appreciate all the small things that make Egypt a special place. So I'm really excited that you're able to go. I know you had some visa issues, but now you're back on track like a true traveler, and I'm excited to hear about your experience, and really looking forward to you kind of getting a taste of the place that I call home.
Yeah, we can't wait to go. But before we get into that, I have one other question that I always start with, which is, how do we actually know each other?
So we know each other through my first real job out of school at Bain. I remember people pointing at you and they were like, "That's not an associate, that's actually a partner."
I'm a little older than I look.
You're by far the youngest, coolest looking partner in our office. I think outside of a few sort of internal groups like Black at Bain, we also work together as part of the junior board of a nonprofit called Alternative. We both connected on our love for music. I think you had shot a few breakdance competitions at the time, and I was doing a bit of music-related events and stuff like that, and that's another way we connected.
Yeah, what I had forgotten was that you were on the junior board at Alternatives, and when I started photographing hip-hop dance battles, I went to one at night. I think I talked about that in the Cambodia episode and how I ended up in an event, but the very next event that I went to was at Alternatives, and they had flyers for all these future events, and I ended up going all the time. And one thing led to another, and I was really interested in the work they were doing, and I ended up joining the board. And one of the things they wanted to do was get younger people involved in the governance of the organization. And I threw up the bat signal and was like, who's interested in joining a junior board for this really cool nonprofit? And I had forgotten that you responded and joined, and that's how we got to know each other a little bit better. And fast forward a couple of years, and here we are across the oceans talking about your home. And I never would have guessed that we'd be doing that, whatever it was, 10, almost 15 years later. Syed, one of the things that always stood out to me was when we were talking about your background, you had mentioned some of the work you did in Egypt. And I just remember being blown away by your story. I've met a lot of people that have done some really interesting things and some really impactful things. And what you described to me was so above and beyond anything that I had heard before that it just always stood out. And I always associated you with that work. And before we get into the special parts of Egypt, I know it's a special part of your background because of that work. Can you talk a little bit about what that was? I really want people to hear it and understand how important it was.
Thanks for remembering that. Yeah, so since high school, I've always been interested in different activist movements. So I always used to participate in different protests and try to kind of volunteer and do work where I can. And the Arab Spring, specifically in Egypt, the January 2011 revolution was a profound moment in my life, and it was very much a mind shift in terms of growing up in an environment where you're faced with the unfairness and the privilege that I had growing up day to day, and feeling helpless in being able to sort of affect change and help people that were less fortunate or disenfranchised. And the revolution was really the first spark that triggered this idea that you can actually change this. And, history is dynamic. It's not really something that's defined in a moment of time, even though at the time it felt like, this was going to go forever. And so when the revolution first started, I was actually in the US at Michigan and was sort of involved in the sort of cyber aspect of it. So posting on Facebook and organizing through social media, which was actually a big part of the Egyptian revolution, if you recall.
Yep.
And got connected with a few activists who together we started this group called the Taharruk al-Ijabi, which translates to the positive movement. And the idea was after the December, so during the revolution, which happened in January of 2011, about a year later, there was a constitutional referendum that was essentially a vote between the approval of a draft constitution that was put forward by an assembly and essentially a disapproval of that draft constitution. And the supporters of the draft constitution argued that the constitution would provide stability at a time when the country was relatively unstable in the wake of the January 2011 revolution. However, the opponents argued that there wasn't enough time for some of the secular parties to really emerge, and that constitutional assembly that put forward that draft constitution was not really representative of all the different factions of society, specifically minorities and protecting minority rights.
So as you're looking at this from Michigan, and there's basically a referendum on the future of the country, did you feel called to be active, or had you just continually stayed active and this was just the next chapter? And did you think about going back home to participate and to engage in the political process?
Yeah, so after graduating, I decided to go back home and start a company. In the wake of this sort of wave of change and possibility, I wanted to start a company that addressed the problem. And in that case, it was a company that tried to convert waste to fuel substitutes, specifically in the cement production process, and also joined this movement, the positive movement, to organize live debates that would essentially provide a platform for some of these smaller secular parties that emerged after the revolution, and to create sort of a direct dialogue between people that were trying to position themselves as representative political leaders and their constituents, in this case, people in mostly marginalized communities around Egypt. So we tried to specifically focus on rural communities and use the 2012 referendum that I mentioned to identify places that were overweight or voted in support of this draft constitution, which we felt did not represent the minorities in the country, and focused on those communities. And it was really, one of the first sort of nationally televised and public debates of that kind. It was a very relatively new concept in Egypt, and it was definitely an adventure.
So speaking of adventure, that's not the word I would use to describe it, because as I was watching stateside at the Arab Spring across the region, it wasn't always safe. It wasn't always peaceful. At least the televised parts of it were not. And so even though your organization was called the Positive Movement, I have to imagine that you were stirring up some serious emotions as you went around the countryside, engaging in what I'm guessing was a new concept of political debate among people that weren't used to having that. Was that work dangerous, and did you feel safe doing it around the country?
Yeah, I mean, in the wake of the referendum and actually ahead of that, there were essentially two factions. There was sort of the more religious faction embodied in mainly the Muslim Brotherhood, and then some of these secular parties, which were a lot more fragmented coming out of the revolution, which you would expect after any revolution for there to be, a fragmentation of parties that would represent different ideologies. But in reality, what we felt was that a lot of these parties were sort of saying similar things, and that creating a platform or a bloc to counterbalance an established party in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood was a good thing to do as a way to unify them. And so a lot of the places that we went to by design actually were relatively less secular parts of the country, or places that were Muslim Brotherhood strongholds, and that created a tricky dynamic. And so we relied on grassroots activists to facilitate the event, which I think was a smart choice that we made. And so collaborating with them was important. We tried to make sure that people from the community were represented in the audience, and it wasn't like a curated group. But at the same time, we also tried to, reduce anyone that we knew was going to create trouble or was going to potentially stir things up. And so obviously these were quite emotional conversations. And I remember a specific time when we were running a Q&A and people were essentially going around. So people from our group, from the Positive Movement, were going around writing people's questions on papers and submitting it to the moderator. And I think the moderator had like flipped through 2 questions that were the same question, or I don't know what happened, but people felt that he was cherry picking questions and everyone just kind of got riled up, and I was actually managing the Q&A, and so I got pushed off the stage on live television, which was a funny situation, but quickly we sort of readjusted and we got people to stand in a line and they could ask their questions in the microphone directly. And that was a quick fix that we kept for the subsequent debates. But it goes to say of just how, emotional and how sort of new these debates were, especially in some of these communities.
When you were describing that to me when we first met, I remember thinking to myself, man, all these people come here and take a gap year and talk about how they backpacked through Europe and visited 8 different countries. And this is how you spent your year finishing undergrad. And I just remember being blown away. If you fast forward a couple years, a decade past that, I imagine, like most things, hopefully you're taking 2 steps forward, maybe 1 step back, but progress and the arc of the universe always bends towards justice. What do you see happening now? Do you see a next generation of leaders sort of taking the baton from your organization and continuing the positive movement that you started back in the 20-teens?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that you always have to keep, and that's something that I learned in the Egyptian Revolution, and I guess that was the initial spark, is that, to your point, the arc of history always favors justice, and you take 2 steps forward and one step backward, and you sort of keep believing that tomorrow can be a better day. And I really believe that, and I've seen how some of the younger Egyptians and myself included have just tried to kind of be excellent, ambassadors and try to change either from the outside or from within. And so that change manifests in grassroots movements and activism, which obviously hasn't been easy in the context of, the current political regime. But you also see it manifesting in innovation, in business, in community work, and also in creating culture. So, we've had thriving music scene, thriving, film production scene, and a lot of world-class artists and community projects have emerged out of that more grassroots type movements that are very much representative of what I would call, less popular or less standard parts of our society that maybe people wouldn't want to highlight in a sort of non-social media, non kind of open internet type of world. So I do think that all those things combined are going to make change inevitable.
Saeed, it's really great to hear about the work and the role that you and your organization played in the much larger context of the revolution. In addition to the country overall being special to you, are there aspects of Egypt that stand out when I ask you, what's special about home? Why is your home special?
Yeah, I mean, Egypt is obviously known for a lot of things, mostly our ancient history. One of the things that tends to be overlooked, which I cherish, is the community and then the people aspect of Egypt. And that's something that I've carried with me, in different parts of the world that I've lived in. So I've always made it a point to be a regular at a few spots and get to know your neighbors, your local shop or your local grocery store, and sort of build those relationships that way. And I think a lot of that just comes from growing up in Cairo, where you tend to have that kind of loyalty. You build those relationships with your local butcher, your local falafel guy, or fulan tameh is what we call it, or your local barber. So I've had the same barber since I was a kid. It didn't matter what I told him I wanted to look like, whether it was Ronaldo or whoever's haircut was popular at the time. I always got the same haircut. And it was funny. I went back recently, and it's his son who looks exactly like him, sits in the exact same chair. And you have that kind of continuity, which I find to be quite unique and really special. Even though neighborhoods change, those people are sort of part of what makes it a constant and really special.
It's funny you talk about the falafel guy and the barber shop. I still go to the pizza place that I grew up going to as a kid when I'm back in New Jersey, and it's the same guy, except just like your barber, it sounds like. I went in there the other day and he had a grown adult son who was working in the pizza shop, presumably going to be the next generation leading it. Have you built those types of communities as you've traveled around the world?
Yeah, I've always made it a point to do that, and I think like I said, that's something that I owe to growing up in Egypt, specifically the neighborhood that I grew up in Cairo. I've tried to replicate that, so I've been cutting my hair with the same barber since I moved to London 7 years ago. Richard, shout out, and he does a great job, even though he now gets booked out weeks in advance and charges triple. But I tried to create the same relationships, or I've also been in the same building here in London for the 7 years that I've lived here. Obviously, it's changed since I moved here in 2016. But I still like going around, like recognizing the guy at the coffee shop, the barber, and the landlady or that I rent from. She's obviously now a good friend, and
Hmm.
I go to her for advice as we try to kind of look for another neighborhood to live in, which is going to be hard to find something that is as comfortable. But I hope to kind of build the same relationships wherever I choose to move to next.
Now, speaking of communities and relationships, the community back home helped you find one of the more important relationships in your life, right?
Yeah. So I think you're referring to meeting my wife. I got married 2 years ago to my lovely wife, Yara, and we met actually at one of my best friend's brother's house party. So I met her at the party in the kitchen, and we started talking, and that's where things kind of started. And I think that's very much emblematic of going back home. It's just you have all these big gatherings, and people meet each other, and there's always people that you've known your whole life, and there's always new people that somehow you've managed to either miss or not meet. So in that case, it was my wife. Even though she knows a lot of my friends, somehow we didn't meet until around that New Year 17 to 18, and we were both surprised that we'd never met each other, even though we have a lot of common friends.
That's too funny. We do a guys trip every year in December, and most of the guys on the trip didn't know each other, but the one who brought us all together actually pulled this group together, and we had such a good time the first time 7 or 8 years ago that we just do it every year. And what I took away from that was if you're really close with someone and you share similar values and similar worldview, you shouldn't be surprised that they surround themselves with people that are like them and have a similar worldview. So when you're close to one, you're probably close to a lot. You have an extended family you didn't even know about, and in your case, you made them.
Yeah.
In your case, you made them real family.
Yes, 100%. 100%.
Syed, you've talked a lot about how Egypt is special to you as a country and as a developing nation. You've also talked about how community is really important to you and how that community allowed you to build really great friendships around the world and in every place that you've lived and helped you find your wife in some ways. Are there aspects of home that we haven't talked about that are special to you?
Yeah, I think when you mentioned that to me in preparing for this, one thing that was a common theme was my house that I grew up in.
Like your
Um,
literal home.
yeah, the literal home that I grew up in. So I grew up in a family house. So it was my grandfather, my uncles, and us on different floors. It had a lot of palm trees, which is my grandfather and my favorite tree. My grandfather was, an entrepreneur, and I'm his namesake.
Hmm.
So I was named after him. So I had a special connection with him growing up, and I feel like I owe my sort of entrepreneurial drive and a lot of my business knowledge to him, and less so my courting skills. We would recite poetry before and after school sometimes, and depending on who my crush was, he would try to find poems that had their names in it, which didn't land very well in like fifth and sixth grade.
Right.
But he actually was really into maps, and so he would buy maps of Cairo every year, and he picked this neighborhood back when no one really lived there. So we would get our water delivered. One of the most sort of vivid memories I have was my cousin and I swimming in the water tank and cleaning the tank every year, which was always the fun the fun activity to do. And because he was one of the first people to move into the neighborhood, the street was actually named after him. So fun fact, my ID has a street that's named after me because I'm named after him.
So the street is literally named after your grandfather?
Yeah, it's named after my grandfather. Obviously, he's a special person, but I think the reason why it was named after him is because no one really lived on that street for like the first 10 years that we lived there. And so they just named it after him because he was the only person there. And I'm named after him. So on my ID, it says my address is, my name, Mu'attam Cairo.
That's awesome. It sounds like you had a really special relationship with your grandfather. Where did you spend all this time with him? Were you at his store or his business?
Yeah, so it was all in the garden. He loved being out in the sun. He's quite active. He would walk every morning for at least an hour. And so, a lot of it was in the garden, in the sun, reading the newspaper and discussing certain news events or discussing different business ideas or different, career paths that I was thinking about. And, one of the moments that I cherish with him is walking to the mosque by our house and going for Friday prayer. And that was something that I felt brought us very close together. And it was always like a big event on Friday to go and pray together and then come back. And my grandmother would have prepared food, and everyone knew that Friday lunch was at my grandmother. And so the whole family would get together, would eat, and obviously there'd be all sorts of funny and dramatic family dynamics.
As only family can do. I am curious, on these walks and in the time out in the garden with your grandfather, was this a little bit of where you got your political activist bent?
Yeah, a lot of it was definitely driven by that. I think at a young age, I sort of was exposed to some of the political realities and the history that Egypt has. And I think, that was definitely part of it. And he was quite active in his own way and also understood the history pretty well. And I definitely owe that part of my personality to him, and just generally trying to kind of position myself within society, especially seeing some of the unfairness that comes with being born in a specific context relative to a lot of people around you that are less fortunate.
Syed, as we start to wrap up here, I wanted to ask you a question about Egypt overall. From my perspective, as somebody who's going for the first time, we're going to have some time in Cairo. We're going to do a tour up the Nile and see some other parts of the country. But I also want to make sure that on the day that I have free in Cairo, I get to experience what I would say is real Egypt, not tourist Egypt. And I wanted to ask you, are there things that I should pay special attention to as I go around the city that when you think of home, make home special for you?
Yeah, I think I'd mentioned earlier that obviously the history and the site are the easy things to figure out that you need to do while you're there. And one thing that tends to get overlooked, like I mentioned, is the locals and the sort of warmth of Egyptians and the hospitality that's sort of inherent in our culture. And, I hope you get to experience that. Some of the more touristy places tend to attract like a specific type of person, but, I hope that you try to find some smaller coffee shops. I think we had discussed, walking around Zamalek, which is a beautiful neighborhood. It's kind of our Manhattan. It's actually an island in the Nile, and lots of beautiful trees, great architecture, small shops, antique shops, and cafes. Mm-hmm. And I think, walking around there, hopefully you get to experience some of the people that I think and the traits that make the people in Egypt special. It is a country of hospitality, and I think that, that warmth permeates throughout most of the places that you'll go to, especially in Aswan and in Luxor, where people are very warm.
That's really great to hear. I am really lucky that we met over 10 years ago. We had a chance to catch up in London before COVID, and I'm looking forward to catching up with you on the back end of this trip when we go from Egypt back to London. Maybe the four of us can grab dinner, but when we get back for sure, I will want to touch base with you and compare notes and share some of the stories that we experienced in Egypt. And I just want to thank you for taking time out of your evening to join me today.
Of course. No, thank you for having me on, and it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of My Home is Special. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you get future episodes automatically. Go to myhomeisspecial.com for the occasional email update too. That's where links to photo galleries and a few other surprises will live. Be sure to follow KBev Photo on Instagram for behind-the-scenes footage during our journey, and it'll be in the stories. If you just want the photos, go to kbevphoto.com. There's a lot else on there to explore. For now, this is Keith, aka KBev, signing off. Peace.